Hello, everybody. I am so happy to be here. I'm actually broadcasting from lovely Minneapolis, Minnesota. For those of you who don't know, I'm very active with one of the national associations, APIA. We have been invited to come speak to NCOIL, which is the National Coalition of Insurance Legislators. They are proposing a model public adjuster act. They've asked us for our input. So we are here on behalf of APIA with Holly Soffer and APIA's president Cole Klein to meet with them, try and talk, see what we can get through and what we can expect, and we'll keep everybody posted. Always going to make a plug, of course, to the extent you are not part of an organization like APIA, you should be sure to join. National associations are critical for this industry because they get the largest group of people together that help fund things like lobbyists to make sure that insurance companies aren't the only ones on the hill, as they say, and that we all have a voice. So highly recommend joining it. And of course, as I always say, make sure you're joining a local organization because they really are the best at protecting the rights within a specific state when it comes to any of your personal interests. So today we have a wonderful presentation all about additional coverages. For those of you who don't know, I've been doing this I just did a perfect claim series that I finished from last year. It was 12 parts. It went really, really well. I was super happy with it. And this series is called Words Matter. And I really wanted to do a deep dive, starting with homeowners policies so that people could get a better understanding of specific provisions, really diving into the definitions last month when we did it. Now we're going into additional coverages. We're going to keep doing this until we walk through the entire policy to get as much information as I can out there. As I tell everybody in every talk that I ever give, I don't want you to have to send me work. In a perfect world, you wouldn't need an attorney to help get a claim covered. And the purpose of these series that I do is to provide information so that you don't have to be calling me, so that you don't have to use an attorney to get coverage that should otherwise be afforded. So hopefully you can use these, get information, but make sure you use the chat too. I will answer questions live as they come up. We've been popping some up on the chats or on the screen live so everybody can read them. So feel free, use it as much as you need. And of course, you can always come back and reference these. They're on our website, on YouTube, on Facebook. They're pretty much everywhere now. So you can go back and look at old sessions as well. But maybe more important, only for me, because I am so excited to be able to announce that forgot to say this important aspect. My personal information, it's all right here for you. My cell phone, feel free to use it anytime you need. Ask me questions. People do it constantly. One thing I will tell you, if I'm not available all the time, just follow up. If you need to text me twice and say, hey, Tony, I didn't hear back from you, I don't mind. You've got complete permission to bug me. I might have been in trial. I might have been at a deposition. I might have been with my family. Who knows? And I might have just overlooked it. It happens. But you've got permission to bug me all you need to get whatever answers you might want. I'm going to start adding these quotes in only because I kind of like quotes and they keep me motivated in some situations. I like this one, that real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. When I started in this industry, I had no idea how much I didn't know. And I'm often surprised at how much information is kind of piecemealed between multiple adjusters, right? Someone might have a really great grasp on slate roofs, but not know anything about a commercial roof. And information is really out there to be gathered, but there's so much of it. And recognizing that we don't all have the answers is really important. But hopefully these slides and these presentations help with that. So what I was getting at and what I'm so excited to announce, we are putting on the PAGPS conference again this year. For those who attended last year, we had 125 public adjusters, not even just from the East Coast. We had people coming from all over the country to come participate in the conference. It was a huge, huge success. So we are putting it on again this year and upgrading it a little bit. We're having more CE credits, an extra half a day to get extra courses in. So, I mean, it's really going to be an unbelievable presentation. It's just outside Philadelphia, right in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. If you haven't signed up, I highly recommend you do it. We're not going to have unlimited space. because candidly, we had more last year than we expected. So while we upgraded, we are trending towards significantly higher numbers this year. So I highly recommend signing up sooner rather than later. It's wildly inexpensive from what I'm seeing across this country for the costs of these conferences and these CE credits. I see conferences going for six, seven, 800, $900. This is literally between 119 and $219. The only distinction being if you are a member of MAPIA, which is the association that is putting this conference on, um, then you get the discounted price at $119. If you're not a member, it's $219. I don't know of a better deal in the entire country to get the amount of credits, the quality of education, and the opportunities that you're going to have if you do. So please take a look, sign up. I even made it a little extra easy. If you can't, if you're watching this on a screen somewhere on a computer, you can actually just scan this QR code. It'll take you right to the website to the extent that you don't want to type in pagps2023.com. All right, enough of a plug for that. Let's jump in. Last week or last month, we talked about really policy basics and jumping into a policy and the importance of the definition section. If you didn't take a look or watch that last session, I highly recommend going back and watching because we went through in-depth analysis of different definitions, how you can use them to your own advantage so that you're actually using the policy against the carrier. They do it to you constantly, so you should be doing it to them as well. You've got to remember, this is a contract. It's a written agreement between the parties, and each side is compelled to comply with the terms of that contract. So you need to make sure you understand every aspect of it and know really the ins and outs of every policy. I've said it before, I will say it again. Read the effing policy. If you think you've seen every policy under the sun, I don't care. Read it anyway, because I'm telling you, they're changing a lot right now, and you need to understand what is in every individual policy. For this one, we're going to be going through the additional coverages. Additional coverage portion of a policy is so critical, and it's truly one of the most underutilized and misunderstood sections of a policy that I ever talk to public adjusters about. There's a lot of aspects that seem to go missed or don't have proper understanding. And we're going to talk about some examples of those today. And I have a feeling that one of my examples is going to be something that most of you would have normally turned down as a claim, but I will show you why it is generally going to be covered. We'll talk about how to use that to your advantage and go through it little by little. All right, so the first question of the day, and I want you guys to use the chat. Do other policy provisions like exclusions apply to the additional coverages? You've got things like exclusion, policy limits, limitations within the policy. I want you to think to yourself, and if you're too shy to use the chat, so be it. But I want you to think to yourself, does that apply to the additional coverages when you're looking at additional coverages in a policy? Thought about it for a second? Good. Because the answer is not always. Most people have this feeling like the exclusions apply to all aspects of a policy, but that's not always true. Some carriers have been very specific about what they write in their additional coverages and within their exclusions, and they don't always have any interaction. In a lot of policies, the additional coverages are a completely independent portion of the policy, which means they act alone. They don't have influence by things like policy limits. They don't have influence by things like the exclusions within the policy or limitations. So those are things that you're going to want to look for when you're doing your analysis of what additional coverages can be triggered and how does it play with other aspects of a policy. And that's really what all this comes down to. Insurance policies are incredibly complex written documents, and how those words all play with each other is really the knowledge base that we need to get to do our jobs. Because if you don't have an understanding of, well, how does this work with that, you're not going to be able to maximize a claim and make sure all coverages that have been paid for by the insured are actually realized when a claim is paid out. So as we've done with other sessions and as we're going to do here, I want you to take a look at some examples. I start with State Farm, not because I just dislike State Farm so very much, and I think they are the worst carrier out there right now, in my personal opinion. But they are also the largest carrier out there and want to make sure that it's a pretty easy example for everyone to look at. We can see here that this is the language that State Farm uses to integrate their additional coverages into their policy. And they use very all-inclusive language, right? The following additional coverages are subject to all the terms, provisions, exclusions, and conditions of this policy. Okay, thank you. I at least appreciate when State Farm tells you what they are going to be doing. Nice one, Mike. Like a good neighbor, stay over there. I like that. But I appreciate when a company actually tells you what they are going to be doing, what they are expecting. I tell people about Farmers all the time, but I think Farmers Right's one of the worst insurance policies that a person can buy. It provides unbelievably limited coverage. It takes away all risk coverage and makes it name peril in some portions, like roof damage. I mean, it's terrible. But I give farmers a lot of credit because at least they tell you that in their policy. They might not be clear, but it's at least written in there somewhere of what they actually are going to be doing on these claims. Some carriers don't do that quite a bit. So this is an example from State Farm. Let's take a look at another one from one of the other major carriers, Allstate. Allstate doesn't have any kind of preamble, any kind of lead-in language for its additional coverages. What it has is two different portions that interplay together in different way. The exclusion portion of Allstate's policy says these are losses we do not cover under coverages A and B. Now, this is what's really important. Coverage A and coverage B are not additional coverage. That's your standard all risk or name peril language that you'll see within the policies. Additional coverages are over and above that, right? Something that isn't otherwise included in your standard coverage A or coverage B. So when when Allstate just says Section 1 additional protection, this is over and above any of those other aspects within the policy. So it doesn't play with the exclusions the same way the State Farm policy will. This is so important because of how you analyze a given loss. If you are making claims for additional coverages, you need to know, hey, do I have to worry about those exclusions or not? Do I need to worry about those aspects when I'm talking to my client and making a valid claim for them? So make sure you take a look at that language. All the carriers are different. Some of them use broad language that like State Farm to cover everything. Some of them say nothing like Allstate. And there's a carrier out there whose provision says, the policy limitations still apply to the additional coverages, but not the other aspects of the policy. Great. You need to know what that difference is and how you are using it when you're adjusting these losses. But let's look at some examples of why this actually matters so much. That was just the additional protections standalone in the Allstate policy. Here are some of those other examples. I put the one down here. These additional property coverages are subject to the policy deductibles, except as noted. I got caught off there. In no event will the deductible be applied more than once to any one loss. That language is good to know because it puts it out there that if this wasn't in there, their expectation is there would be able to be multiple deductibles. And you can use some other carrier language actually against another carrier. It's difficult, but can be done. But it's important to know that they recognize that the deductible language needs to be added in. And we've used this against carriers to say the exclusions don't apply here because you didn't say they apply here. In other words, you say the deductible applies. Great. You don't say that the exclusions apply, and you recognize that you have to say when other things apply because you put the deductible in there. And the court came back and said, you're right, the exclusions won't apply to this provision. All right. We will talk about, so Mark Jacoby asks, explain additional coverage versus extended coverage. Specifically, are sublimits in a commercial policy capped by the business content coverage limit? I'll pop it up here just so everyone can read it. It's going to be very dependent on the policy. Commercial policies, and we're going to do a whole different series on commercial policies next because there's been a lot of questions about the commercial policies. But the sublimit language for things like extra expense, even some other additional coverages or extended coverages in commercial policies can be capped by a content coverage limit. But it's more rare in what I have seen for that to actually happen. But we will go more in detail on that in future ones. So when there is a conflict in this language, right, we've talked about, Do they play together? And if they do, what happens? What about when there is a conflict? If it's covered in one section, but not covered in another section, what happens? I want you to think, how would you play this out, right? Before I give you the answer here, how would you play that out, right? One portion of the policy says it's covered, one portion of the policy says it's not covered. What are you going to do? Generally speaking, you will find that it leads to coverage. I can't say that exclusively because I'm an attorney and I can never say that's always the case. But generally speaking, when you've got coverage added in one portion and coverage taken away in another, it creates an ambiguity within the policy, and that ambiguity must be read in favor of the insured. But it gets even deeper than this. And a lot of it comes down to what's the actual cause of loss? What are really the issues that we're talking about here? And I want to dive into a very specific example so you can see how this plays out in the real world and in a way that will probably change how you adjust some losses. And it comes down to this language for collapse. Most policies, most homeowners policies that are out there will have additional coverage for collapse. They will vary greatly, right? We've got a State Farm example here that you have coverage for collapse so long as that collapse is caused by a enumerated list of things. First, it could be any of the covered causes of loss under coverage B. I think it is under the State Farm policies is contents. The contents list coverage, in essence, the name peril list. If that causes a collapse, you're covered. And it also says under the State Farm and a lot of policies, decay or deterioration can cause your collapse and you're still covered. Now, I didn't put it on the slide, but it's important to note the decay has to be hidden from view, within the wall, something that the homeowner doesn't know about. You obviously can't let a property just get completely deteriorated, pay no attention to it, wait for it to collapse, and then make a claim. But if they don't know about it, if they don't know that there is a problem, then you've got an opportunity to make a claim for collapse. But that deterioration language isn't in all policies. Using the simple example of Allstate here. Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is Allstate's the alternative example. This is still State Farm. Allstate doesn't have coverage for hidden decay. It's not within their collapse provision. So you want to know these things when you're going into it, when you make your analysis. Now, back to how does this play with conflicts of one portion versus another? State Farm's policy, like almost all policies, has a preamble to their exclusionary language called concurrent causation. And that in essence, it's saying if any of these excluded reasons happen before, during, or after your loss, as part of this loss, you're not covered for it. Now, that language is completely BS because the truth of the matter is this policy specifically gives coverage for things like ensuing loss, and the ensuing loss language cannot play nicely with the concurrent causation language, so it's completely ludicrous in and of itself. However, it's still there, and you still have to worry about how you're going to deal with it. So we know that collapse is not covered under the exclusions within the State Farm policy. Well, that's a really easy one, right? Because even though it's excluded, that exclusion specifically says, except as provided in Section 1, additional coverage for collapse. So the exclusion calls out the fact that, oh, yeah, there's additional coverage. But what about some of the other areas that don't have a call out? So under this same exclusionary list with State Farm is wear, tear, decay, marring, blah, blah, blah. Well, the wear and tear provision doesn't have any language that says, oh, except as provided in other portions of the policy, like, for example, the collapse language. Arguably, a carrier could come back and say your loss was caused by wear, tear, and decay, hidden from view or not, doesn't matter. It was wear, tear, and decay, and you're not covered. And you come back and say, well, the collapse provision specifically says I am covered so long as it's hidden from view. How does that play out? And the answer is it plays out towards coverage, right? It creates a facial ambiguity within the policy that must be read in favor of the insured. But it gets even more complex than this. Shocking, right? That insurance policies are too complex. I apparently did not update the Allstate slide, so I'm going to skip right past that for what I talked about. I want to show you a photograph, and I want you to again use the chat other than Mike because he's already posted in there with the last answer. He could say it again. But what is the cause of this loss? I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you to think what is most likely the cause of this loss. All right, we've got a basement wall, collapses into the property, no question about it. What is the cause of loss? Earth movement, hydrostatic pressure, wear and tear. Try to keep it simple with my choices here. Because I know a lot of adjusters who have called me on these losses over the past year. And it's one of the reasons I've wanted to talk about this so badly, is I get calls all the time about basement wall collapses. And I tell insureds one of the number one surprises that when I get a call from somebody who's had damage in their basement, like water getting in, one of the number one problems is that they look at a policy and think, oh, I got water in my basement. Of course I'm going to be covered. Well, as we all know, water in a basement is actually pretty difficult sometimes to get coverage for. Maybe you've got a sewer backup exclusion or a sump pump overflow endorsement that provides coverage, but that's probably going to be limited to 10, 20, if you're lucky, $50,000, and might not cover everything. And you've got issues like this where you can get a basement wall that collapses in as a result of a loss and think, oh, of course I'm going to be covered. And a carrier, 9 times out of 10, is going to look at this and the initial thought is going to be excluded, not going to be covered. So we've got an answer in so far. We got the hydrostatic pressure guess and a few others that are popping in. I'll take a read through. Well, before I wait for too many other answers, I want to give you the actual cause of this loss. And the actual cause of this loss, oh, I thought I put that slide in there. Did I not? Maybe I didn't. I think it's the next one, is wear and tear. And it's covered. Now, let me explain this. I typed it in there, so it's going to be easy for you to understand, I hope. The cause of this loss was the wear and tear to that basement wall. This home was built over 30 years before. All right, so we know that the wall has aged over time. We also know over the course of 30 years, there has been storm after storm, water event after water event that has gone into this that has gone next to this basement and never caused a problem. So if we know that 2 years ago there was a hurricane that came through that dumped 4 inches of rain in the course of 7 hours onto the property, but nothing happened, we know that hydrostatic pressure couldn't be the real cause of what happened because there's been that much hydrostatic pressure before and nothing happened. All right, so we know hydrostatic pressure is out. Earth movement. Well, earth movement is tricky because clearly we can see in this photograph that the earth moved. But the earth movement is just the result of the claim, the result of the loss, right? The earth didn't move to cause it, like a mudslide or rocks falling down the mountain. The earth moved only as a result of the wall collapsing. So what is the factor that changed that allows this wall all of a sudden to collapse? Again, they've been through storms for 30 years and nothing's happened. The only thing that has changed is the age of that wall. And the fact that over the years, there's been a breakdown of that mortar within that wall that ultimately allowed this to collapse in. No one knew about it. There were no signs of issues with the wall. So put a claim in with the carrier. Carrier denies it for hydrostatic pressure, as Jason's guess was, and a good guess at that. And we came back and said, no, hydrostatic pressure wasn't the actual cause. Hydrostatic pressure wasn't the actual cause of this. The cause of it was the wear and tear that was unknown to the insured, and this is clearly a collapse, so we've got our coverage. Court agreed with us. Knowing that distinction, knowing that interplay of the wear and tear provisions, the collapse provision, additional coverages, and the exclusions makes a huge difference for this loss. It was a six-figure claim that had to be repaired, had to do a ton of work to support the house while the wall was refixed. I mean, it was a massive project, and really important to make sure that we had the right argument moving forward. So make sure you have an understanding of these as you're going through and as you're taking, I don't know if you take notes for these things, but taking note of these as you talk about it. So we got a comment from Joe. The other day, someone asked a question close to hidden damage. HOA unit holder wanted to sell, but the home inspector found termite damage in unit holder's attic, which supposedly migrated across barrier from next door neighbor's unit. Issue is holding up the sale. Well, I'm now just reading it and realizing there's no actual question there. So nothing to, I guess, address. Wear and tear is absolutely often a written exclusion, Mark, but when you have the collapse coverage that provides for coverage, even if it is caused by wear and tear, so long as it's hidden from view. That hidden decay of the wall makes this a covered loss. Again, that's where that conflict comes in between hidden decay within the wall versus wear and tear. You've got the coverage for the wear and tear. Um, all right. So I appreciate the comment, by the way, Jason, if this is beneficial. Let's take a look at some other aspects of coverage that you should be looking at and talking about when you're looking at your additional coverages. Debris removal is incredibly common. I honestly can't think of a policy that doesn't have debris removal. And surprisingly, still, there are adjusters that don't have a good grasp on it. If you do, fantastic. But the most important thing I want you to take away right now is that the debris removal can provide additional coverage over the limits of your policy. In this example, it provides an additional 5% of the entire limit of coverage for your loss in the event that you hit a total loss on a claim. This can really play out to be a significant amount of money, so make sure that you're fighting for it. Another thing to know, there are policies out there that have additional coverages for, let's say, an additional 25% of an inflation guard, 25% of your policy limits. Depending on the language of the policy, you probably have a very good argument to say that the 5% is calculated on the total potential coverage A, not whatever's listed on the declaration page. So if you have an additional inflation guard of 25% on top of, let's say, a $500,000 policy, your 5% wouldn't be calculated off of 500,000, but rather what, I don't know, horrible, 500,000 plus 25%, for your calculation on what is your limit for debris removal. Does Richard, I'm not sure if does what come into play before the policy limit? Just clarify, and I'll be happy to address the question. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the language that is used is so incredibly important. It's why I titled this series Words Matter. Here we've got an added coverage for reasonable expenses of tree removal, tree debris, stump removal, things like that, on top of the debris removal. So you could hit your 5% additional coverage for debris removal on a loss. And on top of that 5%, you could get another $1,000 for tree removal because it uses that word also, right? One simple word in there makes it additional coverage on top of it, and really can, all of these little aspects, they add up pretty quickly. All right. Good question here from Jason. Let's see. Let's see if it's a good question. On debris removal, I've always thought it applied to coverage A. However, several carriers are applying it additionally to coverage C. Is this something you can touch on? And did you just say that the 5% debris removal applies to the base limit plus inflation, ... The answer is, it got cut off, inflation guard. So yes, depending on the policy language, I'm not saying it's going to happen in every case, but depending on how they use that language, and let's use this one as an analysis, you could potentially get that on top of it. So this policy says when the amount payable for the property damage plus the debris removal exceeds the limit for damaged property, an additional 5% of that limit is available for debris removal expense. All right. Gives me enough information right there to know if this policy had an inflation guard, I would likely be successful in my claim that it is the inflation guard plus the coverage limit, because it doesn't say the coverage A limit listed in the declaration page like it does in other portions of the policy. It says it's the limit available. It's 5% of that limit, and it's lowercase. It's not a defined term. Well, my new limit, which the inflation guard generally says, the new limit of insurance is an additional 25% on top of it. I could make a good argument for that coverage as well. All right, so Richard questions kind of split into two parts. Does debris removal additional coverage come into play before the policy limits? It can. So debris removal is generally going to be covered, but even if you don't hit policy limits, right, you still have coverage for debris removal up to your policy limits. The real question is going to be in a loss where it exceeds policy limits, how much more can you get as a result of that? Another great question, because there's other ones about PWI that are going to come up later, and I have such a passion against PWI. So, in case you don't know, PWI is paid when incurred. It is one of the banes of existence for property owners, public adjusters, and attorneys because it makes absolutely no sense being in a policy pretty much ever. It's not, we don't pay for insurance to be a reimbursement policy. It's an indemnification policy. I could rant for an hour just on that. But Mike's question is a good one. Is debris removal PWI? And if not, how do we force the carrier to pay it when they are claiming it's PWI? This comes down to policy language. Policy language will often dictate whether or not something is paid when incurred or not. And it'll say things like, we will, it could just straight up say it's a cost we will pay once it's incurred. Here in this policy language, it specifically says debris removal. We will pay the reasonable expense you incur in the removal of debris of covered property damaged by a loss insured. So in this language, unfortunately, I think there's a pretty solid argument that it is a paid when incurred expense. Now, there's still the fight over what does it mean to incur an expense, and I will die on the hill of as soon as a person hires a contractor, whether work is done or not, whether they've actually paid them or not, as soon as the contract is signed, the cost is incurred, and we are generally more successful in that than we're not. I can't say we always are because some judges just don't buy it, but for the most part, we are generally acceptable on those cases. All right, so let's take a look at some other important ones. Temporary repairs. Nothing too surprising here, right? You're covered in the event that you have to make temporary repairs, even if that temporary repair ends up getting tossed and trashed later because of whatever the full repair is. Easiest example is you got to put a tarp on a roof. That tarp is covered. There's two really important aspects of this. First and foremost, and while it's not written in here, it has generally been interpreted to be covered as part of it. If you have to do a temporary repair that unfortunately causes some other level of damage, you're going to have coverage for that. You've got to be really careful because the courts are really, really difficult when it comes to proving that you absolutely had to do it this way. But for way of example, if you put a tarp on a roof and you have to nail it down, any damage caused by nailing it down would be covered as part of the policy and the temporary repairs. The important aspect here is that this language also language also adds in this provision at the end. This coverage does not increase the limit applying to the property being repaired. Why is that so important? It might not be surprising. Okay, I'm still stuck with my policy limits. Fantastic. But what's more important is now when you read this in a policy, if you see a provision that doesn't have this language, it means it increases your policy limits. I want to repeat that because I believe it bears repeating. If you see a policy that makes a call out to say something special, like this doesn't increase your policy limits, it is a signal to you that the carrier knows that they have to put that in there. The carrier knows they have to tell you this additional coverage isn't increasing your limits. And if they don't do that in another provision, it increases your limits. So you want to make sure you have a good analysis, good understanding of that and how it plays with your policy limits when you're dealing with scheduled items that might be damaged under additional coverages when it comes to any of those additional coverages in there. The next one, we got to get another question. What's the position? There's a house fire, roofing structure is destroyed, unsafe. Carrier pushes mitigate further loss. PA opines, 1, the roof is unsafe. 2, we are at policy limits. No reason to waste those funds to mitigate the structure that should be, and I know you can't see it, but the rest is that should be knocked down. If there is nothing to mitigate, right? If mitigation would be a fruitless effort, I'm with it. There's no point to mitigate because you're throwing good money after bad. If you're not going to hit policy limits, I would tell you might mitigate just to appease the carrier, right? The path of least resistance is always the path that should be taken with these guys because, if they want to ask for documents, they want to waste their time looking at stuff, fine. Don't be difficult just because you can be. The same with this. If you can make the repairs and you're not worried about policy limits, fine. If you're nervous about policy limits, well, now you've got another issue, and one that should be addressed with approval from the carrier. And say, carrier, you know, I don't see any basis to do any kind of mitigation like tarping a roof. We've got a concern about policy limits. We'll need to discuss this and then really press them in writing to say, give me some proof that mitigation will have some effect on the property as a result. And if they can't give it to you, then you've got a shot to overcome that issue. All right, another good one that has come up a few times, property removed. This is another additional coverage. And a lot of these, look, I recognize you're not going to have this situation that comes up in every loss or even a majority or even often. But when they come up, it's important that you know that these provisions are in there. Property removed. We pay for any accidental direct physical loss to covered property while being removed from the premises endangered by a loss insured. This coverage also applies to the property up to 30 days while removed. We will also pay for reasonable expenses incurred by you, that's an incurred cost, so paid when incurred, for the removal and return of the covered property. This coverage does not increase the limit applying to the property being removed. So, what happens often, and where it's come up in some cases recently for me, is we've had items that were put into storage in a storage container out in the front of the property as a result of a water loss. The people were away on vacation, so the fire department had to break in, get the water, find out what was going on. Ultimately, they turned the water off, but the property gets boarded up on the front door. Well, this property is now at risk, right? You have a boarded up property where the people aren't home. They get additional living expenses to move out, and they put their stuff in storage in a unit out in the driveway. The items, unfortunately, get damaged while they are in that unit from there was a broken seal in the container. Water gets in, causes damage to them. And the carrier tries to A, call it a separate loss, and B, push all the coverage to a third party and not want to pay the claim. They weren't allowed to do that. The law is very clear on that, and we pushed back. But they were still trying to stick them with a second deductible. And we said, no, you've got coverage for this specific item under the additional coverages as part of this loss. It's covered for 30 days from the same claim. You're not taking a second deductible from them. So just know that if something does happen in that meantime, in those 30 days, they go inspect it and the stuff's damaged. It's broken, right? Some, cleaning companies might do that. They're not on purpose, of course, but things might get broken while they're out. That's all under the same claim. You can still get coverage for that under the same claim. And it's one of the reasons I tell everybody, do an inspection of your stuff before that 30 days is up, just so that there's no issues further down the road. We've got another one of power interruption. We will pay for accidental direct physical loss caused directly or indirectly by a change of temperature that results from power interruption that takes place on the residence premises. The power interruption must be caused by a loss insured occurring on the residence premises. The power lines of the residence premises must remain energized. This coverage does not increase limits. Okay, what does this really mean? There are a few scenarios where independent power could get lost to a specific property, right? A tree falls on a power line that is the supply line to the house. Your house loses power. The rest of the street is perfectly fine, and you've got a covered loss. Fantastic, easy claim. But this actually gets more granular. If you have a surge somewhere in your house that causes an outlet to go out, that outlet happened to power your water heater, and the hot water heater in the house now doesn't work, and the house starts to cool down, ultimately causing a pipe to freeze and break. You've got coverage for that. You've actually got it two different ways because you've generally got your frozen pipe coverage, but you've also got your power interruption coverage. This works for any aspect of a home, though. Surge protector. If you have a surge protector in your home and the surge protector actually triggers and it goes off, if something is plugged into that surge protector that causes further damage, you've got coverage for that as well. There's a lot of potential uses for this in a claim that has otherwise difficult issues when it comes to a loss. By the way, one of those potentials also be with properties. Some pumps that have a power failure or a battery backup that didn't work or otherwise fails. if it's the result of a power interruption. Remember, this doesn't mean the power has to go out at the whole house. Just anything within the house, any power interruption um, that occurs at the property. Um, and in this particular language, as the result of the change of temperature causing damage, you've got coverage for that. All right, let's take a look at what MATS is as I remind myself of the next slide. What is a good way to get around what is reasonable versus a carrier claiming the amount incurred / expense is not reasonable? Reasonable always seems less than any dollar amount sent to the carrier, regardless of proof or documentation. Well, Matt, you and I certainly agree that my measure of reasonable and their measure of reasonable are almost always going to be different. And we take a really strong stance when we have the proof. I actually just got off the phone with an adjuster yesterday. Client had a car drive into their commercial property, and they had two benches outside of their restaurant that were damaged. They had the receipts for them. They have the website where they purchased them, and the chairs or the benches are still available for $799, which is exactly what they paid for them. They have the receipt. The carrier, with no basis, literally no explanation, no reason, says, I'm not paying you any more than $399. And I told him yesterday, I said, look, I will happily take that case. I will not only sue the insurance company, I will sue the appraiser who's refusing to appraise those items. And I will sue the independent adjuster who is representing the carrier and that independent adjuster's company. Because positions like that, despite being a difference of what, $600 and $1,600, $1,000 dispute, no attorney in their right mind would take it, but it just pisses me off so much that I feel like I have to fight them. The question of reasonableness is a hard one to answer, but the best thing you can do is just document it, right? You always want to be the reasonable side, but being reasonable doesn't mean you always have to be the side that moves, right? You don't have to give up on a position. You just need to provide better documentation. Sometimes there's nothing you can do that's going to change their mind, right? There's absolutely no aspect. If they're going to get an engineer out of the property, you send your own engineer. It is incredibly rare for the carrier to change their mind and to change their engineer's mind simply because you got somebody else out there. But if you document it well and you've got a good attorney that you work with, they can often be successful in those cases because you always took the reasonable stance and provided the proof for it. The other good thing you can do, and the best advice I could give for the fight, is to go to the carrier and point to the policy. This is a contract. So ask them, hey, can you show me the language in the policy that says you don't owe for the cost of John Smith to do this work simply because you are estimating that you think it can be done for less, right? The policy doesn't say I have to use your contractor. In fact, there are some states like New Jersey where the carrier, if you are trying to contest the damage estimate from a carrier and you've got your own contractor who says, hey, it's going to cost me 30 grand to do this and the carrier's paying you 15, you can demand the carrier find a contractor who could do it for 15. And when you press them, and I've never seen a contractor follow through with this, when you press them and say, I need a copy of your insurance that'll name me as an insured, I want a copy of the contract that you're going to provide me and give me a warranty that this work will be done, I've never seen one of the carriers contractors actually do those things. And then they start to scramble, they try to find another one, and then all of a sudden they have to pay more by state law. So you can use some of those tricks to try and I shouldn't say tricks, some of those laws in your favor, but that's about the best you're going to have when it comes to these. Fuel oil release. This is a provision from an Allstate policy where it's really important to recognize there are some policies that provide specific coverage for fuel oil releases. It's so important because most policies exclude the pollutants. People try to call fuel oil releases a pollutant. I don't think it is, by the way. Short of the policy specifically identifying it as a pollutant, it is not generally considered a pollutant. But know the policies might have those additional coverages as well. Jason, so New Jersey is the one I know off the top of my head that indicates they have to provide a contractor when demanded. But I know there's other states. It's part of the Unfair Claims Practice Act in New Jersey. All right. Civil authority. This one actually just came up. For those who don't know, there was a huge explosion up in Hershey, not Hershey Park itself, but in Hershey, the city of Hershey in Pennsylvania. that caused unbelievable damage. A bunch of people, it was a fatal explosion. And businesses around the area were greatly affected. I have a client who we're just taking on whose restaurant had windows blown out completely. Everything was boarded up. The carrier said the loss was under the deductible, completely ludicrous. But more importantly, is that she's got civil authority coverage. And what the coverage allows for is any reduction in her sales, for example, because she has extra expense in business income. There was a shutdown of the street as a result of civil authority to facilitate repairs and get everything taken care of. So she lost an absurd amount of business. She's got coverage for it that the carrier is just entirely ignoring. Another nice thing about this provision is you can see that there is no deductible applies when this protection is kicked in. So note those different languages, and note that in any coverages you can where there's no deductible that is applying. Temporary repairs. I think I already talked about this one, so I'm not going to hit it again. So as always, when you guys sign up, there are a number of questions that come through, and I wanted to address those questions, even the ones that have nothing to do with this topic, because I tell everyone that I will. So first, how do you get the additional coverages released without PWI invoices? I told you, I think it was Mike who asked earlier, PWI was going to come up. The additional coverages are not always paid when incurred. There's a number of them that don't indicate that they have to be incurred. And if the policy doesn't say it, if the policy is not crystal clear that this must be an incurred cost, they can't come back and tell you you have to incur the cost for the payment. I've been seeing a ton of carriers who are labeling things paid when incurred when they are not paid when incurred under the policy. Now, we are making a really strong push right now in my office to fight back on paid when incurred in general, but it is unbelievably important that you understand that a lot of aspects of additional coverage aren't paid when incurred, so don't just roll over because they're saying it is. Now, when you do have a paid when incurred provision, you've got to give them something. It doesn't have to be an exchange of cash or a check or something like that, but you've got to give them a contract, an invoice, something to get that released. Again, you're looking for path of least resistance. Maybe you could make a fight, right? You want to send it to me and I fight over the fact that it shouldn't be. But if you can get the invoice, you can get a contract from a contractor, just get it, right? It might not be worth it to push back just because. What's the deal with tree removal, pools, equipment breakdown on HO sinkhole landscaping? Question was a little convoluted or confusing for me, but I want to try to address it. All of these aspects are things that can be part of additional coverages. Tree removal certainly is going to be in almost every policy, some level of tree removal for additional coverages. And you'll see some that have additional coverages for things like pools and other structures that otherwise might be excluded under the other structures coverage. But a lot of times you'll see that the additional coverages still exclude those same things: awnings, fences, pools, things like that won't be part of the additional coverages as well. So make sure that you're looking at it. Sinkholes are another really good one, and they are specific to certain areas of the country. I know we have some areas in Pennsylvania that sinkholes are very prominent, but even across the country, they're a very specific type of loss, and you can get additional coverage for a sinkhole collapse or a sinkhole loss on the property. So make sure you're looking at additional coverages, and usually in an endorsement if you're going to be having that type of coverage. Are additional coverages, in fact, more money over coverage A and B? Well, hopefully by watching this, you've realized that it can be. It can provide money that is not part of the policy limits, that either is completely outside of it or adds a certain portion to them. So make sure you are looking for that when you are doing this. Please discuss building code related items such as ice and water and additional ISO board requirements. At last course, I asked if I should do an entire class just on code upgrades and code related items, and everybody said yes. So I'm actually currently working on that. I will give you the very short version of this. The shortest version is there is a very big distinction between code upgrading because you're required as a matter of code versus only having one option as a result of codes or practices over a decade of doing these, and you can't get it done otherwise. Really simple example is asbestos, right? You've got asbestos tile in a house or asbestos siding. You can't put asbestos back on your house. You won't be allowed to. They don't sell it. It doesn't exist. It's impossible to do it. The carrier, and that's a result of codes and statutes. The carrier is not calling that a code upgrade. It's a matter of repairability. And that is a distinction that is important. If it is simply a question of this is the only way I can get this job done, it doesn't necessarily fall under the code upgrade coverage. Another long one here from Jason. I'll put some of it up, although I don't think all of it will be able to be read. Can you provide thoughts? Loss of rent on a property that is non-leased. Due to a fire, the insured lost the opportunity to rent the property. Policy states, in part, you would have received, quote, and we do not pay for additional living costs of fair, whereas in the silent rental value, due to the cancellation of a lease or an agreement. Crux of the question, insured was denied the opportunity to rent due to a fire. Carrier is grossly underpaying the dwelling and client is suffering. The short version, a lot of this is going to depend if it's a homeowner's policy or a rental policy. But regardless, most of it really revolves around whether or not it's even held for rental. A lot of policies make a distinction between holding it for rental and actually renting it, but almost all of them that do still provide lost rental income if it is held for rental. I have a case right now, though, it's the opposite example. It used to be a rental property, and the homeowner decided to get the tenants out, not like evict them, but they mutually agreed that they would leave and they would sell the property. So tenants left, they fixed the house up and put it on the open market for sale, and then had a loss after that happened. Unfortunately, at the time of the loss, it wasn't held for rental, it wasn't being rented, and there was no legitimate claim under that policy language for the rental, lost rental income. It would be difficult, nearly impossible in my eyes, if any given homeowner just happens to have a second home and they say, well, look, I could have, if I made the decision in a month, I could have rented it. If they weren't actively doing it, it's not going to be enough to make a claim for it. What's your position on the loss to a pair or set provision in the conditions section of the policy? I don't know how I pinned something there. The loss to a pair or set is a great provision within the policy for getting additional things covered that might not otherwise. Everyone thinks of it as like, oh, it's a baseball card set, right? That's something that comes together like that, but it's not true. It can also apply to things like windows, cabinets, right? Things that are bought as a set can also trigger coverage for the pair or set provision. You just want to make sure you read that language within the policy, because how they pay for a loss to a pair or set can greatly vary for the how they're going to pay out the loss. So if you use it for cabinets, sometimes there's language in there that could still allow them to do something like a piecemeal cabinet repair. So just make sure you're looking at that language specifically. What do we look for to determine if it was held for rental? A rental agreement with a realtor, if it was listed on rentals.com, apartments.com, whatever it may be, something like that would be good. Where are we now? I understand the Airbnb industry is in financial distress right now. What additional coverages might surface in an Airbnb case? Well, there's a lot. So Airbnb, and I'll do this as quickly as I can because I know I'm getting close to my time here. I try to keep this to an hour as best I can. Airbnb actually provides an option for their own insurance for people who list with their company. So first and foremost, you want to find out if that insurance is in play, and it almost turns into like a condo situation where you've got a primary and a secondary insurance. So you want to make sure you have an understanding there. For Airbnbs, as long as it is listed on the Airbnb site as available for rental, despite whether or not the person is at the house at the current time, if it's actively being held for rental, you could have your coverages for that, for lost rental income for that as well. As for other additional coverages, I'd have to look or see what the loss was. I don't think there's any way to kind of guess what those ones are going to be, but happy to take a look, Joe, if you need to go through that. what was, I think I missed one before this. What happens when you provide a proof of loss? An insurer says they didn't ask for it, or it's unsolicited. Policy doesn't say you cannot provide one. So this is termed as a hostile proof of loss, right? Where you provide your own to start triggering deadlines that are contained either within the policy or contained within your state's law for responsive time, claims decisions, things like that. As long as you've got the backing of, again, either the policy language or state law, you're going to have a really good opportunity to say you can't reject this just saying you didn't ask. That's not the point. The proof of loss is specifically used based off of, for example, an Unfair Claims Practice Act to push this claim along so that you have to give me an answer, or at least some level of a decision or something within 14 days, sometimes 30, sometimes 10. So if you, as long as you've got the backing to provide it, great. If the policy is silent on it, you're still in the winning position, right? The policy doesn't say you have to ask for it. It says that, when it's provided, X, Y, and Z things happen. So short of the policy language being really specific and saying you only can you only can provide it when we ask, which I can't think of a policy, maybe it's out there. But short of that happening, you've got a good opportunity um, to fight back and still trigger those things. This was a long one about dates of loss and what happened in my last talk, because I had indicated that when a policy indicates they cover accidental direct physical loss, you don't normally need to actually prove the date that that happened, right? The date of discovery is enough to put your claim in, and it's going to be up to the carrier to prove that it's not covered. You still want to be careful, right? If you've got a hail loss to a property, you see the damage on the property, make sure when you report it, report it as the date of discovery. If you're going to try and figure out the date that this likely happened, that's fine, but make sure that that's all clarified with the carrier when the claim is being put in. The issue of this specifically talks about the prompt notice provision of policies. We give us notice promptly. This one was as soon as possible. Well, the reality is, as soon as possible is only when you discover it. In almost every court that I've ever practiced in, it really comes down to a question of reasonableness and a question of prejudice to the carrier. In other words, if you report a hail claim 7 months after the fact, because that's when you discover it, your roof's still in substantially the same condition as it was right after the hailstorm. So there's no prejudice to the carrier. What this really talks about is that you can't delay a claim and cause harm to the carrier, either in their ability to investigate, in creating additional damages, one of those types of things. This plays really carefully with the responsibility to mitigate, by the way, because as we all know, if a client tries to mitigate and the carrier comes out and they say, oh, you didn't let me inspect the property, that is a winnable case. Most of the time, you should be fighting every one of those because both the policy says they have to mitigate, and all they have to do is keep repair expenditures. And the courts have come back and consistently held they followed the provisions of the policy. And most state laws also support that a carrier can't deny it because they weren't shown it unless unless the carrier can show they asked and you refused, which never really happens. So all things that you should be keeping in mind. I know I'm flying through this. I'm talking fast, but we're just getting close to that time. How do you know when and when not to file a lawsuit? So we've talked about this a few times. One of the questions is always going to be the amount in dispute. In Pennsylvania and New Jersey, for me, the amount in dispute doesn't really matter. We've got and I'm, $1,000 case is tough, but we can still file on small claims. We're not turning down cases under 75. We take cases at 15, 10,000, 25 all the time, because we both have a really good system at my office to make sure that those can still move through efficiently. And the courts, especially in New Jersey, have a really good small claims court system that makes life easier. So you've got to think about the amount in dispute. You've got to think about your timing. If you're getting close to that 1-year suit limitation and it still hasn't moved, you should be filing suit. I mean, if you're not getting there within a year, you're not getting there within a year and 2 months. So you might as well file the suit and let that timer start going as well. The other aspect that I always tell people is you want to consider appraisal as well. My partner yells at me all the time for this because he says, why do you want to push appraisal? And I push it because the truth is it can be better for the insured. There are times that cases can be resolved in appraisal and everything is well and good. And if that's an opportunity, if you've got a case that's not very complex, it's a real simple roof dispute, they're great for appraisal. If you've got really complex issues, multiple coverages, multiple aspects of repair, the more complex a loss gets, the more likely litigation is the better option, just because it allows a lot more time and a lot more in depth diving into the issues compared to appraisal that sometimes can kind of go over certain appraisers' heads, depending on who you're using. But all of it are things to be considered. If you're not sure if to take a case to litigation or not, call me. We can talk it out and I will let you know. All right. Thank you all so much. I put the slide one more time up there. I really would love all of you guys to come to the PAGPS conference. There's a few people on here who went last year. I think if you talk to anybody who went, I haven't heard any bad reviews. It might be out there. They probably don't want to tell me because I help run the thing, but it really was a great event, and you'll hear from me personally on multiple classes, along with other fantastic speakers from all around the country. So please consider signing up and coming to join us for that conference. Again, here's my personal information. If you have any questions down the road, please let me know. I will be covering probably a lot of the drinks, Jason. Maybe not the whole weekend. But there's also karaoke, so I'll probably have a few and then just end up buying them for everybody. Um, so we can definitely talk about that. All right. So thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. As always, if you need anything, call me, text me, email me, whatever you need, and I will hopefully see you all at PAGPS in October. And if not, I will see you next month for the next webinar. All right. Thanks so much. Take care.